Hey, everybody. Welcome to the Daniels on Research. I'm David Daniel.
I'm Daniel Willingham. This is the podcast where David and I pick an article that we think will be especially interesting to educators and unravel it a little bit and have a closer look at it.
And Dan found one that he liked for a whole bunch of reasons, and I looked at it and I liked it too. So we thought we'd talk about it. What's the article, Dan?
Yeah, the title is The Negative Effect of Smartphone Use on Academic Performance May Be Overestimated. Evidence from a 2-year panel study. So this is taking on an issue that I think is really intuitive to most teachers, which is we're concerned when we see students in our classroom using tech devices in a way that they're not intended. Most often that's going to be smartphones. And we figure there's going to be learning loss.
All right. So before you get into it, I want to
Yep.
get into in case you're thinking out there of publishing. Sorry, I had hand surgery. Sorry, everybody. And I talk with my hands, so you're going to see this a lot. In case you're trying to publish something, read the title again, Dan.
The negative effect of smartphone use on academic performance may be overestimated, evidence from a 2-year panel study.
That's a title. Right away, you think you're right. You think you're right. You may be wrong. People are going to read that.
Yeah, that's it. That's exactly it. And that's what made this article so interesting to me. As I was saying before you stopped me with that fascinating observation about the title, this is a finding that was an instance where research seemed to really confirm what would be really intuitive to most of us, which is kids using cell phones during their classrooms is not good for learning. Now, there are two types of evidence that have been brought to bear on this. And David, I think you're probably going to want to elaborate on this a little bit, but let me get the two types of evidence out on the table briefly. One type of evidence is an experimental paradigm, randomized control trial. And in these sorts of experiments, the researchers are going to, for example, send a text message to students during class. It's understood. The students know that if I get a text message, I'm supposed to respond to it in some way. And then there's going to be some outcome measure of students, the extent to which they understood the lecture, despite being disrupted. The second type of experiment is a correlational study where you're just going to let students do what, use or not use electronics during a lecture as they would typically do or not do. And then you look at their grades, either at the end of the semester or their grades on examinations or whatever it is, and you look for a correlation. Is it the case that kids who use their smartphones a whole lot more tend to earn lower grades than kids who don't use their smartphones during class?
Yeah, and if you watch this even once, you're going to know I like the ecologically valid versions of that. The way I think of it is we can look in the wild in the classroom, find something that we think is going on, and then we can bring into a more controlled situation to look at mechanisms or to try interventions before pushing it back out to the classroom. So I put more confidence in the messier ones from the classroom if we're trying to make recommendations for the classroom.
Right. So the trouble, of course, with the messy version is everyone knows correlation is not causation, and so researchers try and deal with that by measuring the variables that you think might co-vary with what you're interested in. So to make that concrete, what if kids who tend not to do very well in class kind of know class isn't really for me, I tend not to do very well, I don't really care that much. And so they use their phones more during class than kids who are more invested in their education.
Or what if you got a really, really non-engaging teacher who's going over stuff you can get someplace else, or they're all PowerPoint and you can write down the notes and you have time left over?
Right. Well, if it's a teacher effect, that should be the same for everybody in the class, though, right? If
Everybody
you're
with a
only
phone.
looking at one class, then it's going to be an individual effect rather than a teacher effect. But if you're looking at multiple classes, yeah, then you could have a teacher effect, and you wouldn't recognize it.
Well, I mentioned that just because a lot of the ones that are done in the classroom are done in a single teacher's classroom.
Right. So the way the researchers try and deal with that is they'll do things like get the GPAs of all the students in the classroom. So then they can control for the GPA to see whether what we see as kids who tend not to do well in classes anyway are the ones who are using their phones. Okay, so with all those, and so they'll measure prior GPA, and they'll measure personality characteristics, big five personality characteristics, and so on. With all those, with all that battery, you still see correlations of something like -0.3, -0.4 between cell phone use and final grade in courses.
Okay, so with this particular study, all right, let's talk about the first analysis. All right, so
Okay.
to set it up a little bit, they basically had students sign up for this with cell phones that had an app that would trace their cell phone usage,
Right.
and correlated that with maybe times in class and GPA.
Yes, exactly. Right. It's pretty clever the way they did it, and kind of unusual. So they end up with, this is at a Danish university. They have about 412, I think it is, students in the final analysis. And as you said, they actually are tracking them. They're using the GPS feature on the phone to know where they are when their phone screen is on. And then they've also got the student's schedule. So they know you were sitting in an auditorium and your phone screen went on for this period of time and so forth. So those are the data they've got. And then they're looking at their GPAs. Here's the way this study is different. And you heard the term panel data, which not everybody may be familiar with. All of our listeners will be familiar with that. It's a term that's more often used in economics than in psychology. It basically means because they're collecting data across 2 years, they're going to have data from the same student across multiple classes. And they're also going to have the same classroom with different sets of students. That now enables them to get at some of these confounding variables that we were talking about. They can look within an individual student. Aha, when you took this particular class, you on average used your phone this much, but in this other class, you on average used your phone a different amount. So now I can look within a student and look at variation in phone use and grade. And this allows you to sort of extract out those individual variables that we were talking about, like what if this is a student who doesn't care very much about their academic outcomes.
Yeah, one
You're
thing they
not.
didn't do, which I think would be really cool, is actually flip it and say, okay, in these kinds of classes, students tend to have their smartphones on more or less. They actually could have done that.
Yes, yeah, they didn't do that.
So if you're watching or listening, authors of this study, there's your next pub. Just make a really great title again.
That was exactly what I thought when you said that. I'm like, for all we know, that's in the works, right? That's in the pipeline. That would make sense. You have got this huge, really cool data set. It's probably going to end up being more than one paper. But again, the highlight here, what makes this study really worth looking at is they're not going to know what the individual student characteristics are, but they can be confident that those individual student and individual classroom characteristics are sucked out of the analysis.
Right, and that's going to be an important thing for their second analysis.
Right.
And also, just really quickly point out, they were very transparent about several things. One of them was the people who volunteered for this tended to have a different GPA, a higher GPA, and lower GPA were not as well represented. I don't know what that means in the Danish system, and that you can't tell what was on the cell phone, so they could have been going anywhere. We don't know where they went on the cell phone.
Yeah, and one thing is, like, they were actually just sampling, I think, 15-minute bins, and all they know is that the screen is on, but they did know the duration the screen was on. And they actually, their little rationale for this was, so it sounds like you have no idea what's going on there. As you said, they were pretty upfront about that, but they also pointed out the minimum time the screen was on was usually like 35 seconds. I think there were very few observations when the screen was on for a shorter period of time than that. So they said, even if you got a text message and ignored it, your phone screen would have, automatically clicked off in a short, sooner than 35 seconds. So they said, we're pretty confident that most of these, we don't know what they were doing, but we're pretty confident something was actually happening during that time.
Yeah, it was pretty cool that way.
Yeah. So that was thoughtful.
So guess what they found in the first one? They found in the
Yeah,
first
yeah.
one,
So yeah, go ahead. Give us the rundown of the important
they
analyses.
found a negative correlation between GPA and cell phone use.
Right. So that was like doing the garden variety, sort of trying to replicate the analysis that everybody else has done in the past
Right.
without controlling for those
So
factors.
negative correlation is one goes up, the other goes down.
Right.
Right. So people are just as they're listening. So what they found is the more cell phone use, the lower the GPA.
Right. And then when they made use of the panel data and removed the classroom effects and the individual student effects,
It kind of went away.
it went away. Right. So it's still slightly negative in absolute terms, but the confidence interval included 0.
It went down by about 2/3 after they included all that.
Right.
Another interesting thing they found in the first one is that in-class smartphone use was almost as strongly correlated with high school GPA as the college GPA, which opens up to some ideas with that second analysis. There's something else going on here.
Right.
There's some other mediating variables we might want to look at.
So what's your take on this? Now it's like, here are the data. Let's move on to speculation time. What do you think is going on? We have 3 things indicating cell phone use during class is a bad idea. We've got sort of a basic cognitive analysis. It's drawing away attention. That absolutely makes sense. We've got these intervention studies that we mentioned before. We've got the correlational studies we mentioned before. Now we get this new data, which indicates, no, actually, there's no relationship between cell phone use and GPA. There's something else that's accounting for that relationship you've seen elsewhere. What's your take on what's going on here?
Well, you know how they say not everything's good for everybody. What this is saying is not everything may be bad for everybody. And to me, the nice thing about this study is it says, look, there's more going on here. We need to start looking at that, as opposed to making these broad general swipes. Laptops are all bad for note taking. Cell phones are all bad for sitting in a classroom. Put them in a basket and put them out of the room. There's other measures also, like fear of missing out measures. There's studies that show that if you put it in a basket and leave the basket in the room, they don't do as well as if you move the basket out of the room.
Right.
There's lots of different variables to be looking at here. And what they did with that second analysis was say, look, there are other variables to be looking at here. We have evidence that if we account for some of them, it goes away.
So why would it be the case that give us an example of what you think an individual level, a student level variable could be that would be accounting for the relationship that's usually observed?
Well, I like the one that was kind of alluded to. They're very diplomatic, but they said, look, if it's correlated with college GPA and high school GPA, maybe there's another variable that they're bringing with them. And then we have the low GPA confound. So it may be students who, like you said earlier, whose school isn't for me or they're not engaged in school would have a different consequence from smartphone interactions than the other students. It gets washed out at a higher level of aggregated data.
The others, but they also point out that in at least some studies, they've used GPA as a correlate, and you still you observe the relationship. And they speculate that self-control might be at work as well.
They have several things, and GPA I think is almost too gross of a measure. There's a study that I have right here that I pulled up by Christian and colleagues, where they looked at a very different way and came out with different results. For example, what if I actually send you a text at this part of my lecture, or the class presentation, and then I look at your test scores to see if getting that text that time may affected your performance on the test on that topic, right? The authors of this looked at teacher engagement, course topics, student density, lighting. They listed all these possible intervening variables that can be looked at. Some of them, I don't know about lighting, but the student level ones, the really interesting thing was what you were talking about was self-control, maybe attention, working memory capacity. Since we're cognitive, that we're going to go right there, right? It could be age also. I'm developmental. I'll throw that in. But there's a whole lot of things to be looked at before we can do a global swipe that something's good, or as the title implies, not good.
Right.
It actually didn't say it's not good. It said we need to look a little deeper here, scratch beneath the surface before we can give you really firm recommendations.
Right. Yeah, that's definitely not the conclusion of the article. It's not saying like, well, it turns out cell phones are fine, so like don't worry about it anymore. And it's also worth revisiting the point we were making very early on here, which is this is a population of Danish university students. So if you're teaching sixth graders in the United States, that would be very dangerous to assume that the population is going to um, be exactly the same.
Yeah, and they may not even be use their cell phones as much as they do in the United States. We just don't know. But the interesting thing that they implicated, which I think was right on, and especially if you're teaching right now, during COVID and you're doing distance learning and those sorts of things, the self-control. It's an issue that we're all having to deal with, and that's going to be intervening variable in lots of different things. The inhibition of these sorts of things. It's really something neat to look at. I'm glad they pulled it in as a possible explanation.
So tell me, make this a little more personal for me. What's your policy in your classroom when you're teaching? And does this article make you think any differently about it?
My policy can be summed up in one word: no. Um, I discourage its use. I have 300 people in my classroom, so there's a lot of uh, when you there's a lot of distraction that can be going on to the students around you. My general philosophy is you can do whatever you want, but don't interfere with the people around you who's learning. And there's a couple studies, for example, with laptops, that show that even when you change screens, the people in your periphery, that distracts their attention. If it comes at a bad time, that could affect their attention and maybe their learning in that moment.
Right.
So I'm just trying to mitigate the collateral damage as opposed to on the individual student.
Right.
So I try to discourage device. I also try to teach in a way that you don't want to look at it. So
Right.
that's kind of a nice thing. But in a class with any time, you're going to have natural times where you mind wander. And when you get kind of full or when you need a break, and this may be students who use that during that time, and it may actually be taking the place of that other thing that would happen. And
Yeah, that's a really good point. Right. There distraction's going to happen anyway, and it's all just a question of what's going to happen during it. But as you say,
exactly.
there's the collateral damage issue.
Yeah. So what do you do? What do you think?
About 5 or 6 years ago, I started making my class, and like you, it's my typical class size is about 350. I turned it into a no devices class, and I always during the anonymous student evaluations at the end of the semester, I have several questions for students about that, and it's been very consistent every semester, which is the modal response from my students is initially I really didn't like this and I was kind of angry at you, but by the end I saw the point and I think it's good. And one of the questions I always ask is, should I continue this in future semesters? And it's usually about 85 or 90% of students say, yeah, you should continue this.
Yeah, I give the last
Oh,
two
sorry, go ahead.
rows. I give the last two rows. If you want to have device, you can go to the last two rows. No,
Yeah, and I always make an announcement in class. First of all, for some students, it is it's an accommodation. They have trouble writing or whatever, and I don't want those students to feel self-conscious. So I always make an announcement in class, like if I don't want this to get in the way of your learning. If you feel like you really would prefer to go on laptops, like come by and talk to me about it, and we'll work it out. And there's usually most students are quite open to at least trying it. And for a student who doesn't have an accommodation, I'll usually say, like, do you want to try it for just a couple of classes and see what you think? And this is what I started to interrupt you with. The other thing I found is that I think I would have had more trouble doing no devices 10 years ago. And now there's a lot of self-awareness on the part of my students anyway. I'm on my devices all the time, and they actually kind of welcome the idea of, okay, for 75 minutes, I'm just going to do this. I'm just going to, try and think about cognitive psychology. And they know themselves well enough to know that if they're taking notes on a laptop or whatever, popping over and checking social media is going to be almost irresistible for them. So they're happy for me to make the rule. So it's like a Christmas club. It's like, I need enforced good behavior. I need to, like, buy in, and then I have to put that money in every week, or something, something terrible
We have
happens.
to compare entrance requirements. I love that way your students kind of, the way you reflect, the way you talk about how your students like, it's actually, I know me well enough to know this is not a bad idea.
Yeah. Anything else you wanted to extract from this article?
No, I think if you do research in this area, this is a nice guideline, not a guideline, it's a nice suggestion. Hey, start looking at these other variables. There's some really
Right.
neat things out there, and they're probably related to bigger things besides smartphone use. So
Right.
it could be a good boomerang back out to some bigger ideas. And if you're a teacher, you probably already know this to some degree. There are some kids that it's more distracting for than others,
Right.
which makes for a modal policy, right? What's the best way to thread this needle to get what you need from your students and get them to engage in the way you need to.
Well, I think that's a great last word for this episode.
All right, man. I'll talk to you soon.
All right. Thanks. See you.
Bye, everybody.